Good afternoon and welcome to Dynamic Health. My name is John Pranger, and today we have a special guest by the name of David Crowe, and we'll be talking about his website, which re-examines the AIDS hypothesis, or the HIV/AIDS hypothesis. Then we're going to have a discussion with David about Stephen Lewis and his campaign on behalf of AIDS victims, or perhaps it's only in aid of drug companies. And the two definitions of AIDS that concern the population of Africa and the different definition of AIDS, which is routine everywhere else in the world. And David is going to be commenting on that and how he was barred from protesting at the University of Calgary. Hi, David. Hi, David. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
There we go. All right. And we want to talk with you today about the definition of AIDS and about your encounter with Stephen Lewis, who is more or less kind of an AIDS guru, I suppose you could call him.
Yeah.
David, do you want to talk a little bit about who you are and your background and the group that you work with? Because my computer is down, I can't get any information.
Oh, okay. Yes. I founded the Alberta Reappraising AIDS Society in 1999, and this was due to my growing interest in the ideas of some scientists who had questioned whether HIV causes AIDS or not. By 1999, I had already seen not only the damage that AIDS drugs could do, the psychological damage that the diagnosis itself could do, but I'd seen how people who refused to cooperate with the system would be abused. I think back then the case that was freshest in my mind was the case of Sophie Broussard in Montreal. She had two children. She was HIV positive and quite healthy. She had two children that she did not want to have medicated. And in the end, the state, the province, took the children from her, and they went, I think, to her father, where the state insisted he agreed to medicate them. She would not. In the end, Sophie died, and I think it was. You've probably heard stories of when an animal is hunted and it just drops dead in the forest from a heart attack because it's so scared from the trauma of being hunted that it's not actually shot by the hunters but just dies.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's what happened to Sophie. I mean, she took her children, she kidnapped her own children and went to Africa. She got sick. She found it difficult to work over there, and look after her children. So she ended up coming back, but she was, her body and mind and spirit were broken by the time she came back. So that was extremely traumatic for me, and so I decided that I would want to do something about that, to form a society, to start putting information on the Internet regarding the flaws in the science surrounding HIV and AIDS. And I think now I have one of the biggest databases of scientific information, which is presented on the website as a list of quotations directly from scientific papers, categorized by topic. So if you want to know about false positive HIV tests, if you want to know about the danger of AIDS drugs to mothers and pregnant women, those are categories that you can look at, and you can see the raw science, the publications, and you can see the flaws, not through my words or the words of other dissidents in this area, but through scientists who believe the theory but record some of the anomalies.
Okay, and tell us about your run-in with the University of Calgary, and especially your run-in with Stephen Lewis.
Yeah, well, Stephen Lewis was coming to Calgary as part of some leadership training course, and so I had, written to the people who were organizing it and asked if I could come and ask a question of Stephen Lewis, and they denied me that. So I wrote back to them and said, well, would Stephen Lewis answer in writing one question that I put to him? And they said, no, it would be inappropriate to do this. So anyway, he came a little later to speak to a group at the University of Calgary. It wasn't sponsored by the university, but it was at the university campus. And so with a friend, I went out there, and I had some pamphlets, and they had, just some statements like AIDS drugs are toxic, and then it gave an address on the society webpage regarding the toxicity of AIDS drugs. And HIV tests are not accurate, and it gave a URL, and it had a little bit of other information on there. And we stood in the lobby, and we handed out these pink pieces of paper with, basically a bunch of website addresses on and a couple of paragraphs of information. They didn't notice us. It was actually very successful because they didn't notice us for about 15 minutes. But then they realized that we were not part of the system. They asked us to leave, and we said we believed in freedom of speech, and we weren't planning on leaving. And then they got the security guards out, and we were basically harassed to the point that we left. And we were told that if we came back on the University of Calgary campus within 24 hours, we would be arrested, which I thought said a lot about freedom of speech and universities in the current climate.
And also that the police would be very concerned to come and bust you rather than some drive-by shooting or other major crimes that occur every day in our city.
That's exactly right. I'm not sure the police would have been too enthusiastic about arresting somebody for the crime of freedom of speech, but these days that seems to be one of the biggest crimes. Certainly the U.S. government feels that way, and the current Canadian government seems to feel very similarly that people who speak up are not welcome.
Now, Stephen Lewis doesn't publish any adverse reactions, any hint of anything being wrong with these drugs that he is virtually marketing for them.
I just went on his website today, and I searched for the phrase adverse effect.
Yeah.
And I got 0 hits. I searched for side effect. I got 0 hits. I searched for liver because, liver failure is a big side effect of many AIDS drugs. And I found lots of occurrences of the word deliver. He seems to like the word deliver, like time to deliver, but he doesn't like the liver, which is a target for AIDS drugs. But when I searched for life-saving drugs, I counted at least 15 occurrences where he said that antiretroviral drugs were life-saving. And I don't know how drugs that have a toxic and fatal side effects can be considered life-saving without qualification. Maybe on balance you could say they're life-saving, but they kill some people. But he's not saying that. He's calling them life-saving. From what you would gather from his website, there's nothing wrong with these drugs at all.
And what about his sponsors, or how about the people who fund his... you can't get anywhere in this world without fund. I know that from a very bitter experience being part of a anti-vivisection society. $5 here, $10 there.
Right.
But this guy commands
Stephen
millions.
Lewis gets a lot of money, and I wrote to the Canadian government, and because he has a charity called the Stephen Lewis Foundation, and I asked for his financial statement for the year 2003, which I believe was his first full year of operation. And he had $1 million in donations that year, which is a little bit more than the $5 here and there. And I was communicating with some of his employees and trying to find out a little bit about the donations. And they were, of course, saying, well, we can't give you names of people who donated. And I said, I don't want that. I'd just like to know the categories, like how much came from drug companies, how much came from foundations, the government, from private citizens. That's what I want to know. Just give me the categories and how much was in each category. The only useful information they gave me was that the largest donation was $100,000.
That's very considerable.
Yes, and but they wouldn't tell me where it was from. And then after this little demonstration at the University of Calgary, I got an email from Stephen Lewis, the only communication I've ever had with him, where he said that he had instructed his staff not to ever communicate with me again.
That's a pretty strong reaction for a simple question.
Well, it wasn't. It was the fact that I had embarrassed him at a speaking engagement by handing out alternative literature. I think that was really what it was, and it became an excuse, I think, for him not to talk to me about his financial information. You know, he didn't want to. I don't think they had any plans to tell me anything, but of course this was a good way to say, you know, you're a radical. We're not going to talk to you at all. So we're not hiding. But there's no information on who the donors are. There wasn't at that time on his website. Now there's a little bit of information because I think they got $1 million donation from the big newspaper. I think it's from the Aspers.
Oh, I see. Yes.
Yeah. So they're talking about that, but that doesn't mean they're not still getting money from drug companies. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. I suspect that they are because Stephen Lewis acts like a drug company salesman.
Yes, he sure does. And his enthusiasm and his verbosity, some people call it eloquence, I say it's verbosity.
Yeah, yes. He's like a preacher, and, you know, this is a faith-based initiative, this whole AIDS thing. You're supposed to take his words on faith. You're supposed to accept that people are dying of AIDS in Africa, and I think we'll be able to talk about the definition of AIDS in Africa, and that the drugs are life-saving. So they have this fatal illness. We've got these life-saving drugs. It's a pretty simple story he's spinning for people around the world who haven't investigated this.
You think that the donors would be very proud to have their names up in lights?
Well, that's what I thought. I went to some other websites, you know, like the Toronto Sick Children's Hospital, and, you know, a lot of these organizations have like a special web page with their donors. You know, I go to the symphony or the opera, and there's a page in the manual or in the program that has the donors, and, you know, which ones are in the $1,000 category and which ones are in the $100 category. Everybody's very proud to have their name at the back of the program. I mean, some people are anonymous, but there's obviously a lot of people who want to have their name up there.
So there's something very suspect about David Lewis not wanting to. He says it's a matter of privacy.
Well, that's fine, but he should still produce at least, you know, the categories of the organizations or people who are giving him money. Absolutely. And a simple question: are you taking money from drug companies? I think is extremely important.
Yes. To
be answered.
And we're all looking for transparency in these organizations lately because of the many times that we've been stung by, you know, Enron-type accounting and so on, and by charities who raise a lot of funds and don't really account for them.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, these charities can. Everybody thinks charity and they're doing good, but in many cases, the charity is a financial instrument that can be used to funnel money to certain people. Like out here, a lot of the laser eye clinics are formed as charities. Well, that doesn't mean they're run for free. They may give, you know, some eye surgery for free, and that's very good. But the people who essentially own the charity are the doctors, and you know, they're probably getting fees as member of the board, and you know, fees for each surgery and things like that. So it's totally a profit-making venture for the doctors, but it's structured as a charity, which probably gives them all kinds of tax benefits. You know, it's not because they entirely want to do good.
Oh yeah. Well, the former head of the FDA has just been fined several thousands of dollars for a conflict of interest there, and that speaks volumes because that organization is one of the most corrupt on the planet, in my view. Tell us about the definition of AIDS as according to the World Health Organization, and tell us for Africa, and tell us then what the different definition is for AIDS in places other than Africa, and how is it that science can be so malleable as a consequence of artificial borders?
Well, the definition of AIDS is probably one of the most critical issues because when people talk about AIDS, they don't really know what they're talking about. They know people are dying of it. They know it's you know, transmitted by a virus, and they know that it's like a fatal virus, that everybody gets the virus dies. But you know, if you ask them what exactly are they dying of, they probably couldn't tell you. And in Africa, the Bangui definition is used. It's called that because in 1986, the World Health Organization, the CDC, and others got together in the city of Bangui in Central Africa, and they established this definition. And although there are different definitions in Africa, they're all essentially the same. There's very small differences between the national definitions. So basically, they break AIDS symptoms into three categories. They call them the major signs, of which there's only three, which is a weight loss of more than 10% of body weight, chronic diarrhea for over a month, and a prolonged fever for more than a month, although it does not have to be consistently for a month. So you could have a fever the beginning of the month and the end of the month, and that would qualify as prolonged fever. And then there are minor signs, starting with persistent cough, generalized pruritic dermatitis, and a few other things. Now, to get a diagnosis of AIDS, you need two major signs, one minor sign, and no HIV test. So what they have done in Africa is they have redefined malaria, tuberculosis, and malnutrition, and a number of other conditions as AIDS. And instead of nutritious food, clean water, basic medical care, what you need are expensive antiretroviral drugs. And one of the most damaging things about the antiretroviral drugs is that they cause anemia. And, of course, many Africans have anemia because of malaria, because of parasitic infections such as hookworm infections. So these drugs are more dangerous in Africa than anywhere else in the world. And, in fact, even Stephen Lewis was quoted in by a Chinese news agency recently as being concerned about the high death rate in Malawi in people starting antiretroviral programs, although that hasn't stopped his running around the world talking about life-saving drugs.
And anemia, and severe anemia, is one of the certain outcomes of treatment with AZT, is it? That's
correct. In fact, most AIDS journals would have a full-page glossy advertisement for a drug, it's not really a drug, called Procrit, which is erythropoietin, which is a blood-stimulating enzyme. That's one of the best-selling medical compounds in the world, is this thing called Procrit. And it's specifically advertised for patients using AZT. So it says in the advertisement, Procrit is useful for patients suffering AZT-induced anemia. And that's in just about every AIDS journal.
Really? So one drug to counteract the toxic effects of another, and that's more or less the whole yo-yo game that goes on in medical science today. You know, you put one drug on the market and 10 more have to be used to counteract the effects of that damn drug.
Yeah, that's how the system works. And, of course, that makes the system very profitable. If you were a doctor who said, you know, you need to eat better, get more exercise, more fresh fruits and vegetables, you wouldn't do very well. But if you gave people drugs that cause side effects, that cause the people to come back, you know, you're generating a lot of business. And, you know, I don't think doctors do that intentionally, but what it means is that the doctors that produce the most sickness produce the most business. So those are the ones who are very successful.
Sure. Yes, when their profits depend on sick people, then the more sick people, the better.
Yes.
And if you can make people artificially sick, well then,
yes.
Let's give that a try.
Maybe we should talk about the definition of AIDS in Canada and the United States.
Yeah.
In Canada, the definition of AIDS is about 30 different diseases, which are either infections or cancers, and usually the presence of an HIV test, although some diseases like Kaposi's sarcoma, which is a kind of skin cancer, can result in an AIDS diagnosis without an HIV test. So basically, in Canada, you need to be sick and you need to have an HIV test. Canada, by the way, has very few AIDS cases. There's something like about 200 new cases a year in a population of around 30 million. So it's a tiny, tiny problem in terms of how the mainstream defines.
Well, more people are killed by NSAID, the non-steroidal, whatever they are, painkillers, in other words, aspirin, that sort of thing, ibuprofen, than are killed by AIDS. So.
Yeah, I mean, there was a study in the U.S. that estimated that 106,000 people a year are killed in the United States by properly prescribed pharmaceutical drugs in hospitals. So that would be about 10,000 people in Canada. So you put 200 new AIDS cases in Canada against the 10,000 a year killed by pharmaceutical drugs. Mm-hmm. And then those are AIDS cases, and the number of deaths is smaller than that. It's around 100 a year. So it's a really tiny problem. But the interesting difference between Canada and the United States, or one of them, is the definition of AIDS. The definition I described in Canada is also applicable in the United States, but there's one addition. In the United States, if you have a low CD4 cell immune count plus a positive HIV test, in the absence of any clinical illness, you will be defined as an AIDS patient. And by 1997, almost two-thirds of new AIDS cases were in that category. Healthy people with 2 laboratory tests. And that's one of the reasons why the rate of AIDS in America per capita is 5 to 10 times that in Canada, depending on which statistic that you use. So two-thirds of the new cases in 1997 were in healthy people. And of course, those people are put on AIDS drugs, and then they get sick, and then they die, and they become a self-fulfilling prophecy. And you might ask, well, why am I using 1997 statistics? Well, every year the Centers for Disease Control produces a surveillance report, which is a many-page document full of statistical reports on HIV and AIDS, and every year it's dumbed down. And in the 1998 report, they removed all the information on the number of healthy people who were being diagnosed as AIDS, probably because it was well over two-thirds of the new cases. And by now, who knows, it could be 90% of new AIDS cases in America are in that category. We simply don't know. The CDC won't tell us.
Yeah, and meantime, vast amounts of money are being spent, and time is being allocated to finding out finding a vaccine, and there are many clinical trials that are happening now, and they want to actually shoot up everybody, every man, woman, and child with the AIDS virus, if they find them, and of course they're proving these things on monkeys, and then they go right into the clinic, and we don't even know what kind of injuries are being sustained there.
Yeah, they've certainly abused a lot of animals in AIDS research, and it's been quite futile. They've claimed that they were able to make one chimpanzee sick with AIDS. But given that AIDS is such a broad definition, they might just have been able to reduce the number of CD4 cells in the monkey, and in a chimpanzee, pardon me. And
yeah, that's the music that tells us we pretty well have to go, David.
Oh, okay.
I'm sorry. I wish we had more time.
Well,
Thanks
we can do this
much.
again.
Let's do that. Let's do that. I'll give you a call.
I had a lot of fun. Thank you for having me on the show.
All right. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.